Josh Hennig here on 97.3 ESPN. Of course, today is the big game, LSU, Alabama. Here, all the action coming up at 3:30 on 97.3 ESPN. And joining me now on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline, you catch her on SEC Nation, presented by Regions Bank, every Saturday from 10 a.m. to noon Eastern Time on the SEC Network. Of course, they are at Moore Hall today, University of Alabama, ahead of LSU versus Alabama. She is Laura Rutledge. Laura, how you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks for having me.
I appreciate you jumping on. So, I can only imagine the crazy amount of energy down there. You guys travel all over the place in the SEC on the SEC Network. But it feels to me that the big thing with this game is this has a little bit of a different feel because these are not your traditional LSU-Alabama matchup.
Yeah, it's so true. And it's funny because everyone's kind of referring to that 2011 game of the century between these two teams. But those two teams look totally different than what these two teams are, because these teams have an Alabama and LSU, and Nick Saban did it first before LSU did it, really evolved with the times offensively and realized that if they were going to compete with the elite in college football, they needed to be able to get the offense going in toward more of a speed and space direction, get that RPO game going. It allowed Alabama to recruit players like Tua Tagovailoa and bring in more offensive weapons. Their receiving core full of NFL talent. The same to be said for LSU with the changes that they made even as recently as this year, and we're seeing it all come to fruition. And these two teams are electric offensively. It is. It's almost unrecognizable for what you would have thought LSU and Alabama have been in the past. This is what they are now. It's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting to see these two offenses battle it out, because it really does feel like two of the best in the country going back and forth, and you wonder which defense can handle it better than the other defense.
And it's interesting because, you have on the panel each week Marcus Spears, LSU alum. Well, no offense to LSU, but I don't see a Marcus Spears out there this year. So to me, this is really going to come down to which quarterback steps up in this game.
Yeah, and it's a good point. I mean, in the past, this has been all about the line of scrimmage between these two teams. The front sevens on both sides just were powerhouses and beasts like Marcus Spears. We don't really have that in this game. And I think what you'll see instead is more of the secondaries factoring in, especially knowing that both of these teams want to throw the ball around. And both secondaries are good, but they're not so good that the receivers can't get separation. And so we really may see, kind of a lot of that. And I do think that these teams are hungry on both defensive sides to prove that they're better than people are talking about. I mean, look, they're the ones, too, that hear all of us just talking about the offenses and not the defenses. So that probably factors in some, but at the end of the day, it's going to come down to the quarterbacks. And I think Tua's injury is something to consider. Everything I'm hearing, he's healthier than we think, healthier than he was the last time he had this type of procedure done on the other ankle. But still, it's got to be in the back of his head. If LSU's pressuring him, making him uncomfortable, is he, maybe not as accurate as he could be otherwise? You think back to the last huge game that Tua was in. It was a national championship game against Clemson, of course. And remember, he threw that interception early. It felt like, and credit to Clemson because they had a great game plan. They had a great game plan offensively, too. But it felt like after that, Tua never really was himself again. If he throws an early interception in this one, you wonder, is that in the back of his head in addition to not feeling 100%? I think that's where, LSU early on could use their defense to get an edge. But you're right. It does come down to the quarterbacks here.
It's been speculated about a lot of people. I'd love to hear your perspective on this, is that people feel like this game is actually more important for Alabama than it is for LSU because of Alabama's weakened schedule compared to LSU that has played more top tier out of conference games. What is your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think there's a reality to that. And what I would say is that, yes, it has to do with the schedule, and that's a big reason why. But another thing, too, is the committee has got to be sensitive to setting a dangerous precedent of putting Alabama in when they're not a conference champion. The reason I mentioned that is because, remember, that happened a couple years ago. Now, Alabama validated it because they won the national championship. But it's still something that the committee doesn't want to do. As long as their parameters stay on there, that they value conference championships. And look, if the college football playoff is going to expand, that's when maybe you don't care as much about conference championships. But as of right now, they consistently say they're not expanding. And so if they devalue conference championships all of a sudden as a pattern, that's going to become a problem. And I think that's going to be in the back of their mind. So it will be interesting. If Alabama loses this game, maybe on a fluke play or something that, is unforeseen that I can't even think of right now, that would allow them to still be considered one of the 4 best teams by the committee, they'll have a real dilemma because LSU would have another chance to, continue on going throughout their SEC season and then win a conference championship. Alabama may be able to carry on with the rest of their schedule, which just is not that impressive. And that's going to be a problem when you look around the rest of the country where there are some teams that could vie for that spot that Alabama will be trying to get into.
Laura Rutledge joining me on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline on 97.3 ESPN, host of SEC Nation, presented by Regions Bank, that airs every Saturday from 10 a.m. to noon on the SEC Network. Again, LSU, Alabama, hear all the action today. Kickoff at 3:30 on 97.3 ESPN. And Laura, speaking of the SEC, even if Alabama gets through this game, there's another landmine, and that landmine is Auburn. That's a huge rivalry game.
Mm-hmm.
And, even if they beat LSU, we've seen in the past that Auburn has ruined the destiny of Alabama in the past. So I think that even if they get past LSU, which is obviously, not a foregone conclusion, that Auburn is still waiting in the reeds, and they would love to be spoiler because they also played Georgia this month too.
Yeah, it's an excellent point by you. And I think the other point with all that is that this game is at Auburn. And so Alabama's going to have to, go to Auburn and try to win this game when their season could be on the line at that point. And it would be the perfect scenario for Auburn to try to play spoiler. And all these questions about Gus Malzahn's job and, maybe at that point he is coaching for his job and that's all the talk around that game. He could be super motivated. And this Auburn D-line may be the best D-line in the country. I think that's why a lot of Auburn fans are really upset about what's happened with them this season because they feel like they have a championship caliber, national championship caliber defensive line, and they probably do, and it's just the offense that hasn't been up to snuff. So I would really circle that game. If Alabama handles business against LSU and carries on fine here, until they face Auburn, that's one that you just never know. And it's cliche to say, but I really do think it's true in this rivalry and probably in most rivalries that you do have to throw out the record books. You throw out everything that the teams have done throughout the year because all bets are off in a rivalry game like the Iron Bowl.
If Alabama doesn't run the table, if they don't beat LSU or they fall to Auburn along the way, they lose the SEC championship game, how many scenarios do you think there are that could keep Alabama out of the playoff?
Yeah, I think that's kind of one of the main scenarios would be if you see LSU win out, you see maybe, or here's another thing too, everyone's forgetting about Georgia. Georgia's at that 6th spot. If Georgia wins out, and let's say they beat LSU, well then if that's LSU's only loss, LSU's probably in, and Georgia's got to be in. They couldn't leave Georgia out if they had beat, maybe at that point, the number 1 team in the country in LSU. And then I think another scenario that could leave Alabama out is even specifically in the Big Ten. If Penn State beats Ohio State, and that's Penn State's Ohio State's, only loss, then how are they going to leave Ohio State out? And then you got to keep Penn State in there. So there are so many possibilities, and I think a lot of it revolves around the Big Ten and the SEC. And the committee does not want to put teams from the same conference in, but they may be forced to. The other conference to keep an eye on would be the Pac-12, because I think Oregon's still out there kind of sneaking around. And then, the other thing would be the ACC and Clemson, because if Clemson is undefeated and they win the conference championship, despite what the committee may think about the way that they look, the committee used the eye test to put them outside of the top 4 right now, and their schedule to put them outside of the top 4. They would have to put them in. You can't leave an undefeated conference champion Clemson out, and that could really put Alabama's position in jeopardy.
All right, Laura, before I let you go, I want to pull the curtain back a little bit, and we got to ask you, what's it like dealing with the eclectic group of Feinbaum, Tebow, Spears, Marty Smith, McGee? You got one of the most eclectic group of casts on a show on ESPN, period.
Yeah, I think half the time I feel like circus clown, or people are like, oh, you're leading the circus. And I'm like, no, I think I feel like the clown trying to keep these guys under control. And the other half of the time, I think I feel like a kindergarten teacher trying to get them to all calm down and be quiet when we need to move on to the next topic. But at the end of the day, they are such a fun group, and they have so much football acumen between them, whether it's Feinbaum, who's such a historian of the game and has seen so much, or Marcus Spears, who played the game, or Tim Tebow, who's one of the game's greatest players, and McGee and Marty bring so much to the table too. So it is crazy. And as you might imagine, our conversations on our bus that we stay on throughout the season are just things that you probably not safe for work, but the best possible way. And it really is so much fun. I enjoy those guys, and even though I have to scold them sometimes to keep them in line, it's a blast.
Again, it's SEC Nation presented by Regions Bank every Saturday from 10 a.m. to noon Eastern Time on SEC Network. She is Laura Rutledge, the host of SEC Nation. She's joined me here on the Boardwalk Honda Hotline. LSU, Alabama, do you have a pick?
Yeah, so it's so hard to choose this one because my mind is telling me to go with LSU. I just think their offense is going to be better, and I like what they've done so far this season. They've already played in some big games, but my gut tells me to go with Alabama. So I'm going to pick Alabama. I just think the fact that this game is in Tuscaloosa and Nick Saban's coaching in it, and it just feels like a game that Alabama finds a way to win. So I'm going with the gut pick, even though, like I said, my mind tells me to pick LSU, and the numbers and the research I've done tell me to pick LSU, but it's just hard to pick against Alabama and be right.
Laura, thanks again for joining me on the show today.
Thank you for having me.